Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is the How-To Talks by Postdocs. And today we have a very exciting speaker. I'm just going to let everybody come in and get settled and and then we're going to get started. Okay, again, hello and welcome. This is the How-To Talks by Postdocs, where we have postdocs from the VCU community come and talk to us about different things that they know how to do, whether it's a scientific technique or a career device or something that they have done that has really helped them in their career. And today we have Dr. Jamel Simmons. Jamel received his undergraduate degree in engineering from East Carolina University and his PhD in biomedical engineering from Virginia Tech. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow in biomedical engineering here at VCU with Dr. Olivares Navarrete and is part of the VCU ERACTA program. Jamel has 10 years of experience mentoring undergraduate research students in STEM fields. And today he will be sharing with us how to do that effectively. And I'm so excited for you to hear him. So Dr. Simmons, please take it away.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. And can everyone hear me all right? Y'all can do like a thumbs up or. So then let me see if I can share the screen. Let's go from the beginning. And can everyone see the screen showing the first slide, How to Talks by Postdocs? Cool. So for today, we'll be talking about mentoring in STEM, specifically how to develop and support your research mentee. So some of the things we'll talk about today is getting to know your mentee. Then we'll get into developing a mentee compact. This is going to be a large portion of the talk. And Dr. Wall emailed out just before this presentation a sample guide for a mentee compact. Then we'll get into goal setting. Then we will get into talking about improving ways of communication, providing helpful feedback between you and your mentee, as well as monitoring your progress between you and your mentee. So the first thing is, depending on your lab environment, your students can come to you from different backgrounds. They can come to you in different environments. So it all depends on what you need and also depends on what your lab needs. So if your research advisor is looking for more of a lab tech type of situation, you may run into students where they will just learn one or two techniques. So it could be something they just do PCR or they do ELISAs, and that's something that they learned, and then they do that for their entire lab. Another situation I've come across will be where a research advisor will give a undergraduate student to a graduate student or a postdoc, and they'll work with those students. The graduate student or the postdoc will work with the undergraduate students one-on-one. So that undergraduate student, they can support the postdoc or the graduate student with their research. And a third model that I've seen done in some labs is to have students have an individual project. So they may spend a few weeks training with a postdoc, a lab tech, or a graduate student. And then that undergraduate student, they will spin off on their own and they will have their own individual projects. So when a student approaches your lab for gaining research experience, it's important to know what type of lab environment you have and what your research advisor sort of expects from students, whether they'll be like a lab tech with learning a few techniques, they could work with you one-on-one, or that student could eventually have their own projects working independently. So it's good to know what will happen when they join your lab. So let's just say that you're going to enter the one-on-one pairing agreement where a undergraduate or like a high school student is going to be working with you as a graduate student or a postdoc. So some things to cover in that first meeting that you have with your mentee is, why is the student interested in research? Get to know some of their background and some of their skills. Also look at the time commitments that your students could have if they join your lab, and then also give them a little bit about your background. So this is going to be a sort of mini interview. It can be formal, it can be informal. So just looking at why a undergraduate mentee could be interested in research, they may have plans for going to medical school, going to graduate school, or they just could be looking for more exploration. I've worked with undergraduates where they never heard of research until they got to an undergraduate institution or like a higher education institution. So they're just exploring to figure out what research is about, what you can do with research, and pick up different skills. Students can also look at research as a way to expand on what they're currently learning in other areas. So let's say you have a mechanical engineering student that's interested in a biological field. They can join a biomedical engineering lab or a biological lab and pick up skills there that they can then add on to their education that they're getting in a mechanical engineering program. You could also have students that are trying to reach a program requirement. So at Virginia Tech, we usually have a lot of students that are in biomedical engineering as a minor, and part of their requirements are that they have at least 4 credit hours of research. So I could have potential mentees approaching me because they're interested in graduate school and they're trying to get research, people that are exploring and figuring out what they want to do, and then also students that are just meeting a requirement or they're part of a special program. So this is something to talk about with your potential mentee in that first meeting. Also get to know some of their background and skills. So a sophomore undergraduate student is at a different level than a senior undergraduate student. So a sophomore may not have a lot of the background knowledge that they need to work in your lab. So that's something to consider and something to figure out early on is what sort of coursework do they have that's relevant to your research areas in your research lab. If they don't have much background experience, you may have to supplement what you're doing in lab to sort of build them up so they know more about the background areas. Also look at previous research experience. So they may be in a biomedical lab, but they probably have experience in a biology lab like the previous semester. So they may already know how to pipette. They may already know how to do some different types of assays. So that could be beneficial because that's less time that you'd have to spend developing your mentee. So that's something to ask during that first meeting. Also look at other types of leadership positions or work experiences. They could have some hard or soft skills that transfer over. So say your lab is interested in computational work and the student may have experience with computational software. They might have experience with statistical software. So they could have some skills that aren't directly research related that can transfer over, and that can benefit you and also benefit the student when you're working with them. So these are just some things to take into consideration and ask during that first meeting where you're getting to know each other. One of the big things that I like to talk with students about in person up front is their availability. So if this is a student looking for research credit, how many semesters are they trying to be with me? Could it be 1 credit hour for 1 semester? Are they trying to do 4 in 1 semester? Are they trying to do 2 semesters with 2 each? So it's very important early on that you figure out about how many semesters the student is trying to stay in that lab. Also look at their availability per week. So depending on the projects in the lab, I would know about how much time I would expect from a student. This could be 6 hours, it could be 8 hours, it could be 10 hours. So I communicate that up front, and then you figure out from that student how many hours can they actually commit towards lab. So if I'm looking for a student to commit 10 hours of lab per week in lab, and they can only give me 4, they may not be a good fit for that lab and you may not decide to take them on. Also look at their coursework and time commitments. Undergraduates, they get very busy. Some of them could be in course overload where they're taking 18 or more credit hours. So if you have a student that's really heavy with the course load, they may not be available to spend as much time in lab as you would like. So that may not be a student that you would want to take on for that semester, and they may have to come back another semester. Also ask your students if they have part-time or full-time jobs. A lot of students that I worked with, they need a second source of income to supplement their education. So they might be working part-time or full-time. It's a non-negotiable for them. So if you have a student that has to work like 20, 30 hours a week, they may not have the time to commit to a research lab. So then they may have to come back for in a future semester. Also look at extracurriculars. You may have some students that are trying to rush for Greek life, and whatever semesters they're rushing in, they are extremely busy. So that is something to look out for, is what sort of extracurriculars these students have outside of a full-time or part-time job and other types of coursework requirements. And on the receiving end, it's good if you can talk with your mentee about your background, like your education, how you got into research, and discuss the different types of projects that you're currently working on and projects that you're interested in. If If you and your mentee do decide to continue on together, where you're working in the lab, they may start seeking you out for advice about your path and get a feedback from you on things that they can do to get into graduate school or go the medical route. So it's good to discuss your background with your mentee as well. So if you have any questions at any time, just feel free to put them in a chat and I can address them as we go on. We'll have different types of checkpoints throughout. That way I can stop for questions if you have any. So are there any current questions? You can put them in the chat or you can unmute. Okay, so we'll move on. So then after you've gotten to know your mentee a little bit and they've gotten to know you, this is the biggest piece that I'll go over for this presentation, but the next part is, what are the expectations? What do you expect of your mentee? And what can they expect of you? And this is where we start getting into a mentor-mentee compact. So a mentor-mentee compact is pretty much just an agreement between the student mentee and the student mentor. It's similar to what you would see in a class for a syllabus. I like to call it like a syllabus for research. So it's just expectations of what you expect from them, and then expectations they may have of you. And then I also use this document to provide additional resources such as topics I want them to look into and also papers that are relevant to the lab. So it's like a multi-page document. So my reason for creating a compact is pretty much I have about 10 years of experience working with undergraduates. I've been working with them since I was an undergraduate myself. And I've worked in areas from like biological research to animal behavior to engineering. But then I got more involved with students when I got to graduate school, where I'd have anywhere between 4 and 5 at a time. But then no matter how many students that I took on, I kept seeing some of the same issues popping up with students. So instead of me just trying to remember this off the top of my head and going to these one-on-one interviews and discussing them there, I decided to keep a document of issues that I found when I was working with students and ways to sort of address them early on. So let's see, saw something in the chat. Okay, so are there some student types we should not invest our time in? How to know the distinction? Sometimes students perform better for credit or if they're paid for, but volunteer students might be too unfocused or too busy to get things done. So for the first part of that, so are there some student types we should not invest our time in? So it pretty much just depends on what you're willing to put into the student. So if you're willing to work weekends and work evenings, you may be able to invest the time in that student if they're only available in evenings and weekends. It's just on you to figure out what you would put up with. Also, if a student can only commit, you want a student that can commit 10 hours, but they can only commit 6, you may be able to give them a small project or give them something that they can help assist you with here and there. So it's pretty much just up to what you're willing to put up with for a semester or 2 semesters. So if this is going to be your time, it's ultimately going to be like, what's a deal breaker for you? And like how to know the distinction for students that you should or shouldn't invest your time in. So that all comes down to how much time you're willing to put in and what are going to be your personal deal breakers. For me, when I was a graduate student, I was in the lab evenings, I was in the lab on weekends. So I was fine working with students over evenings and weekends sometimes. Other graduate students from other labs, they don't want to work weekends. So if you had a student that was trying to work a lot of weekends and get training on weekends, that student wouldn't be a good fit for those potential mentors. So that student wouldn't join that student wouldn't join that lab. Sometimes students perform better for credit, paid or unpaid. So paid versus unpaid and volunteering students. I've worked with volunteer students, paid students, and for credit students. The volunteer students, it just depends on their motivation, but usually I would see some of the volunteer students, they would sort of drop off towards the end of the semester when things got really busy. Whereas the credit students, they get a grade at the end of the semester, they have a report to turn in, so they can't just drop off. So there is more of a commitment because their grade is tied to it. And then students that are paid, That can be a mixed bag because if they're paid hourly, the students can just decide at the end, towards the end of the semester, they don't have the time, and then their hours go from 8 hours a week down to like 2 hours a week. But if they're just getting paid weekly, like a weekly stipend, then that's a different situation where you tell them you're getting paid weekly, you need to meet these X number of hours to continue being paid, or you'd have to leave early. So it just depends on the student themselves, the rules around the student, and what you and your lab is willing to put up with. But it ultimately comes down to the research advisor and you as a mentor of what you will and what you will and what you won't put up with. So hopefully that answers that question. So for me, back to like creating the research compact, the reason I created this document is because I wanted something to give the students in advance. That way they would read over this document after they express interest in the lab. And if they were still interested after reading it, then I would meet with them in person. I'd go over these things page by page with them. And with this compact, I was able to help filter out students that weren't able to commit the time that I needed. And I was able to sort of set realistic expectations with the students. So I've usually see students come in, they're super busy, they want to work evenings and weekends right away. That's not something that you can expect as a student starting off. You need to be able to work business hours, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 is usually when people are getting trained. So if a student can't do that, then I filter those students out quickly. And that document helps me do that. So some of the sections that I have in my example of a mentee compact is I talk about my lab environment, the time commitments, my training objectives, my teaching methods. I also talk about my expectations of students, my expectations of them for presenting their research, what students should do to be able to get a reference letter from me. And this year I added the expectations of a mentor. I usually integrate this in when I'm just working with students one-on-one, but this year I'm just explicitly putting it there of here's what you can expect from me as a mentor. And then at the end of my document, after they have the signature portion, they have recommended topics that I want students to look into and keep up with as they're training with me so that they have this foundational knowledge of what the lab does and what the projects are and what the projects, the goals of the different projects that we have. So the document was emailed out earlier. So if you have that, you can pull that document out and follow along. This presentation only has some snippets of what's in that actual document. So this is just an example of what I would put in my document for research time commitments. As an example, I would tell the undergraduates I expect at least 10 to 20 hours of lab hours per week. This is going to be spent both in person, performing techniques, as well as reading literature. For me, I expect students to not just work in the lab, but they also need to be reading research articles and other resources every week or every 2 weeks, just depends on the different projects they have going on. I spell out if you're signed up for research credits, here's how many physical hours you need per research credit. This sort of information is usually put in a departmental guide or a document for students, so it could be there. If not, you would tell your students up front, for every credit hour that you sign up for, here's how many physical hours you need to be in the lab. I'm explicit about the training portion of Monday through Fridays when we train between 8 and 5. Training is not going to take place in the evenings or over the weekends. After the student has been in the lab for a few months and they're more independent, they can work in the evenings and weekends without supervision, but during the training periods, it's Monday through Friday between the hours of 8 and 5. For the research training objectives, this portion came about when I'm thinking of when these students go out and they're interviewing for graduate school or interviewing for jobs, what sort of things do I want them to know and be able to articulate when they're meeting one-on-one with a potential employer or potential graduate lab. So I want my students to be able to talk about the research questions and the hypotheses for all the projects that they're working on. I want them to understand the literature, the relevance of what we're doing in the lab, and talk about their specific roles on each research project. I also need them to be able to work independently and I want them to be able to help train fellow undergraduate students. So if they're able to do this, then that's something that they can talk about when they go for a potential job interview or they go to another potential lab for graduate school. Cool. I was just checking the chat. I'll talk about assessments and teaching methods. If a student is signed up for research credits, I tell them you will need a written report by the end of the semester. And the research advisor who's assigning the grade, they talk about the length and the frequency. For presentations, I expect all students to at least present at least once per semester. That could mean a group lab meeting or some other forum. And for the teaching methods, I have a variety of ways that I help teach students. So this could be group meetings where we're talking about research and bouncing ideas off each other. This could be individual meetings where I'm checking their understanding of the readings. I give them assigned articles to read. We do hands-on experience, hands-on learning. I give them independent projects, and I also have them do student-to-student teaching, where I have one potential mentee teaching another mentee how to do things in the lab. So that gives them another experience of helping to train others. Here's an example of what I want for attendance. I want the students to plan to show up weekly. I used to have some students where they would only show up if I specifically emailed them a different task to carry out. But I want students in the lab to have more of a structured schedule, almost like a job, where they're coming in on these days. And that helps me to be able to plan when I have multiple students. I can't always send an email to every single student every time there's a task to be carried out. I put it on the students to update me weekly of their availability. So this could be weekly, they send me an email of what they're available for Monday through Friday, or we can have like a Google Calendar where they put their availability and I can see this. So that's something that's really helpful if you have like several students at once. When it comes to research meetings, I expect students to show up to individual meetings and then also to group meetings, because these group meetings are where we discuss different topics, bounce ideas off each other. And if there's multiple undergraduates in the lab, these are ways that the undergraduates can help support each other when they're giving updates of what they're doing in lab. And also tell students that once I give them articles and resources to read, I expect them to read those articles, because I'm going to have more like one-on-one meetings with them to see what they're understanding from those articles, if they have any questions, and how those articles apply to what we're doing on these different research projects. So I've had some students where I give them articles like week after week, and then when we're doing these techniques in lab, they just have tons of questions, and it's like really apparent that they haven't even read any of the articles. So for some students, I make it mandatory that in addition to I'm giving them the readings, we schedule weekly or every 2 weeks time to go over all those articles, and I have them summarize everything that they've been reading to me, so I know that they're reading those resources. And also I can also check for understanding when we have these one-on-one meetings. And also I also talk about lab work and communication. When working with samples, I make sure to tell the students that these aren't test samples. Sometimes students may think that these samples are unlimited, and if they make a mistake, you have extras laying around that they can try again with. With animal work and some biological work, those may be the only samples. You don't have backups. So I tell the students, be careful when you're working with the samples. Make sure you have everything you need before you start. If you're unclear, seek out clarification. That way you don't lose these samples. I've had multiple students where they just rush in, they're in a rush to get to like a class or something, and they're going through these protocols, and then they end up ruining samples because they didn't check to make sure they had all the reagents they needed, or they were unclear about a step and they couldn't find me in time because there was like a time sensitive step. With lab upkeep, I also tell students that to be a clean lab member. I've had some students that are messy. This way I just tell them we're doing daily tasks, we're doing weekly tasks, we have lab assignments for cleaning. I also have a section where we talk about how they can communicate with me. For the most part, they can meet me in person, they can communicate through email, or they can text me. If you're fine with your mentee having your number, go for it, but do put some sort of restrictions on when they can and can't text you. Like, I don't want to have a text from a mentee at like 10 o'clock at night of a question that they have. So if you do give out your text, your phone number, do make sure that You tell them when they can and can't contact you. As far as presentations go, I added this section recently. I make sure that students know that when they're working on materials for the lab or the institution owns the research and all the data associated with it. The students just can't go out and present anytime in any place they want without prior approval. So this section is where I tell students, the lab owns the data, you need approval. If you're going to give a presentation, which I expect them to do at least once a year, make sure that you notify your research advisor and your research mentor in advance. And then that gives us time to check over and edit materials as needed. And also make sure that the students know to include their funding sources and any lab members that they receive training from to help them complete those projects. I've had a few students where they just forget to do an acknowledgement section and they just skip over the funding sources and all the lab members that help them out. So that's something that you can put in your research compact of how to do the presentations and what to put in them. As far as references, in the past, I've had students, they'd be with me for a semester or two. They go off, they graduate, they're looking for me to do a reference. And I've run into issues where the reference materials ask me to speak to a student's independent or their ability to work independently, if they're self-motivated, how they are with time management organization. If a student wasn't really active in lab and they pretty much just shadowed me, or they didn't take a more active role in their research training, I can't speak to any of those qualities. So I'll tell the students, here's what you need to do to be able to receive a reference from me, and here's what will not get a reference from me. I spell that out in the research compact so they know in advance. And then at the end, I also tell them about the expectations they have of me. So as a mentor, I'm going to advocate for my students. I'm going to be available for meetings that are both formal and informal. And then I will try to be as supportive and encouraging as possible. We will have regular meetings for different types of feedback. And then I will try to help my mentee gain independence in the lab as a research scientist. And in addition to what we do in lab, I also encourage all my mentees to attend personal and professional development activities. This is something that undergraduates may skip over when they're here. I try to make sure that my mentees go to every opportunity that they're available to go to. And even after my mentees leave, if they need a reference or they need assistance after they leave, they can feel free to contact me and I'll do what I can. And then at the end, that's where I start listing out the different types of topics and materials that I expect the mentees to understand and look into while they're training with me. So now after you've created your compact with the different sections and you've finalized it, and you go over this with your potential mentee in that first meeting, if you both agree, you can both sign the compact. And this is the document that you both can revisit as needed throughout that first semester. It could be the second semester. As long as that mentee is with you, you can revisit your compact as needed. And if you need to adapt it, you can adapt it as needed as well. So are there any questions that we have about the mentor-mentee compact and the development of the compact and different types of sections? You can put it in the chat, or let me see if there's something in the chat. Any recs or advice for mentoring first generation or non-traditional students? And with those two groups, at least for first generation non-traditional students, you can help them out with resources outside of lab. So some students that I've worked with in the past, like they don't even know that grad school is a thing, or they don't know that grad school is a thing. So that's something that you can talk about with your mentee if they're first gen or non-traditional students of graduate school is an option. Here's how to get into graduate school. Here's what you can do beyond your undergraduate. Because even for me, like when I was going through my undergraduate, I didn't know that grad school was a thing until I think my third year when I was in my undergraduate. And that was only because I had a research professor reach out to me specifically to join their lab to do research. So there are a lot of things that some students just don't know. So you as a mentor can help sort of develop them and sort of be a guide for them while they're training with you for the future. So if you have first gen or non-traditional students, You can seek out, there's like online resources for working with first-gen students. You could have multicultural centers. Some campuses, they have a first-generation office, and some campuses also have a research office for undergraduate students that have resources for working with underrepresented and underserved groups in research. So that's something you can check out to see if VCU has a first-gen center or an undergraduate research center. And if not, there are definitely some online resources. For me, I just help my students find different types of speakers or different types of talks or different types of conferences. Like I encourage students to go to like ABRCAMs or SACNES, which targets underrepresented and underserved students and also first-gen students. So those are some things that I encourage students to look into, and also the resources for those organizations. I can pull some resources from those organizations to give to my students. So does that sort of answer your question of like resources? Like those, they're pretty much everywhere. Okay. I saw another question. Is this compact signing something? Okay, so is this compact signing something binding or just an agreement? How do the students react to need to sign this off beforehand? So this compact is not the same as a contract. So think of a contract to be more binding, and a compact is more of a guideline for expectations and how people will behave in the mentor-mentee pairing. So the way you develop your compact, you can be as strict or as free as you like. So it just depends on the wording in there and how you develop your compact. And you can tell your mentee when they're going over it with you, this isn't like if you sign this and if you end up breaking like a bunch of glassware, we're going to kick you out sort of thing. It's just an agreement for here's what I expect of you and here's what you can expect of me. And if things happen where you need to sort of address them as they pop up, you can do that one-on-one. So how do students react to the need to sign off on this beforehand? In the past, I've never had them sign off on it. Like this document I go over in person, and then I would just have a verbal sort of agreement of like, did you read this? Do you have any questions? I'm going over this with you one-on-one. Is there anything that you're unsure about? Any questions you have for me? And then it's more of a verbal agreement. This year, I actually included that signing section, but some mentor-mentee agreements do have a sign section, some don't. It just depends on what you want for your lab. So our lab has a lab manual that discusses some of those sections in the compact, which students read and sign upon during the lab. Should you still include those in the mentor-mentee compact if they are already in the lab manual? So whatever lab you're in, great that you have a lab manual. I've never encountered a lab that has a lab manual. I've usually always been the person that has to do this sort of stuff. So if your lab already has a lab manual, you can adjust your compact as needed, of telling them read the lab manual, and then adding on sections that you need specifically for you that aren't addressed in the lab manual. So that can be something that you develop on your own, and you may want to discuss that with your research mentor as well, because you'd have your students sort of agreeing to something in addition to that lab manual. So hopefully those answers the questions that y'all have for those. So any other questions? So for this next piece, now that you have that working agreement made between the mentor and the mentee, the next thing you want to look into are what are the goals you have for your mentee while they're working with you, and how will you as a mentor support your mentee to reach those goals? So for me, when I work with students, my end goals are either a conference poster, you could have a goal for a publication, you could have a goal for oral presentation. It just depends on how long that student's going to be with you. Usually, depending on the program, I've had some students only be there for a semester. I have had some students be there for 2 semesters. In your labs, you could have students be there for 3 or 4 semesters. So the longer they're there, the more, the bigger the goal. But usually for me, I try to get them to get them to submit for a conference poster. And that's usually going to be a 1-year timeline. So this is just an example of what what do you expect to get out of the research? What does your mentee get out of the research experience, and how you develop those, help them develop those skills and a timeline to reach those goals. So we'll specifically look at a conference poster timeline. So say you take on your mentee in fall 2021. They don't really start in August because the classes start at the end of August. So let's just say in September, they have all their training. They train with you September to November. Students are usually gone for break, so don't expect them to be there like December, at the end of December, and then January. Then they come back in the springtime. You can give your students a small piece or a project so that they can own that as their own. And then usually around mid-April is when some of these conferences start accepting poster abstracts. So then your student can submit for that around mid-April. Usually students are gone in the summer, but around the summer is when they can probably find out if they've been accepted into a conference, or it could be early in the fall. And let's just say they are accepted. Now you have from September to probably November, when some of these conferences start happening, to finalize materials, and then your student can also practice presentations for, let's say, an October or November conference. So that's going to be a full year just to get them to that point where they're submitting an abstract, they're getting accepted, and they're going to a conference. So that is a 1 year timeline. Chat. Okay, cool. So like what, or so to reach that, over that 1 year period, what are the types of skills that you want to help that mentee of yours develop? So there are two sets of skills that I like to talk about, are hard skills and soft skills. Hard skills, these are more things that are needed for a job. So a hard skill could be, you have experience with computational modeling, you have experience with like data analysis and statistics, you have experience with biomechanics. So those are examples of hard skills. So in your research lab, your mentee training with you, they would develop different types of techniques needed to complete those research projects. And those will fall under the hard skills they would need to help them prepare for those conferences. Some examples of some of the soft skills, these are more like interpersonal. So how is your mentee on a team? Are they dependable? Are they a critical thinker? Are they flexible in the lab when things happen? Are they self-motivated? How is their persistence and their resilience if they reach a barrier or obstacle and they're having trouble? Do they give up at the first sign of like trouble? Or are they the type to sort of meet a barrier and then find a way to overcome it? So those are some soft skills that your mentee would need in the research environments that they would need to have developed over that 1 year period. So this is just an example of some of the skills your mentee may need to develop for that conference that they have in November. So just having the background knowledge and the technical skills, those fall under the hard skills your mentee would need to learn, as well as data analysis, verbal and written communication. Those are skills that your mentee will need to develop over that 1 year, because they're going to have to make that poster. They're also going to need to create an abstract, and they'll also need to present that poster in front of an audience. They also need skills like time management, problem solving. Over the 1 year period, hopefully you can develop their confidence so that they're more independent and they're more stable in the lab. And then also work with them to sort of bounce back when they reach an obstacle in the lab environment. So those are all things that they would need to sort of develop over that 1 year period, working towards that conference goal. So like, how can you as a mentee how can you as a mentor help build these mentee skills? So for example, helping them out with the background knowledge. So you can introduce them to library databases so they can learn how to research their own questions that they have for the projects. You can also have journal clubs. That's something I've done in previous labs where we have undergraduate students. They select a paper, they present it to the group, they sort of lead a discussion on those papers, and we do those week to week to week. And then you can also have students help you with literature searches to get them more familiar with the research surrounding your projects. When it comes to learning some of the lab specific skills, this will just depend on your lab, and then you work with them to sort of learn protocols and learn how to do different types of assays or use different types of equipment to carry out your research. So you can help develop them in that by giving them tasks to do, where you're first training them and supervising them, and then slowly you're backing off and letting them work more independently without supervision. So that's how you can help develop their technical skills. And then also working with data analysis. Some students are comfortable learning statistical software and some statistical techniques, others aren't. It just depends on their comfort level. But I at least try to introduce students to it, at least in their second semester, so they have some idea of what they're analyzing when it comes to their posters. As far as helping to build confidence, usually when you give your student techniques to carry out multiple times, each time provide feedback on what they did well, some areas of improvement. That way this sort of helps improve their confidence in the lab as well. At least so that the better the confidence they have, the more sure of themselves they'll be in lab. Helping to develop their written and verbal communication skills. So you can have students write reports at the end of the semester of things that they've done, sort of summarizing their research. You can have them give presentations to your lab group. You can do journal clubs where they have discussions. You can also do one-on-one meetings. So you're giving them multiple opportunities to write and talk about their research. As far as like time management, at least in the second semester, that's when I start having students work more independently. So usually I would give them multiple tasks to carry out over a week or over multiple weeks. And that student would develop a plan to carry out those tasks and get it approved by me. So you can help them by giving them multiple action items and deadlines and having the students meet those deadlines. When it comes to problem solving, you can give students some small tasks that you haven't worked out yourself and then help them work out that task on their own. So any questions on that timeline and helping your mentee sort of develop different types of hard and soft skills over that 1-year period? So there's a question in here about how do I structure journal clubs? So it just depends on the labs that I've worked in. Other labs, the research advisor, they would structure the journal club. So it would be all the different research groups or research areas would be in one room. So then one group would present to the entire lab, and then they talk about the paper of like the background, the materials and methods, summarize the results and discussions, and then the group would ask them questions. So it's like a Q&A session after each person presents a paper. I've also been in other labs where it's more of you give them papers related to what you're currently working on in lab. So if I'm working on optimizing a microfluidic chip, I can give them papers on microfluidic fabrication, and then we can discuss one-on-one or in a small group, like different fabrication techniques, some of the pros and cons. So it just depends on your research group and how you want to structure it. But I just use that as an opportunity for them to get exposure to reading journals, summarizing journals, and also discussing points from those journals. So that's the main goals of the journal clubs. So another question, how much time do you usually plan to commit to each mentee for a semester? So for me, when I was at Virginia Tech, I did computational work, animal behavior work, and biological assays. I had students that helped me for each one of those projects. So I tell one student over here, I would need 10 to 20 hours from this student on this project, but this student over here, I can do 6 hours for this project. This student over here, I'd probably need about 12. So it just depends on my project. And after I know how busy my protocols are going to be, that's when I would sort of figure out how much time I would want a student to devote. So if you do things like cell culture and you're doing that every single week, say you do that every other day, that could be like an hour of time that you're spending taking care of your cells. So I would want at least 3 hours of cell culture. I would at least want 3 hours of my undergraduate working with cells and doing cell culture per week. So I'd add that on top of how many hours I want them reading, add that on top of lab tasks, add that on top of other protocols that I want them to work on. And that's how I come up with my sort of like 10 hours or my 10 to 20 hours. That's how I usually do that.
Hello, I was the one that asked that question, and more so of what I meant was that, I know it takes time for a mentor to prepare what they're going to teach someone, and that process takes time when you're doing the training as well. So how do you schedule in that time for you to train them? Like how much additional time? So if a task takes an hour for you, then how much additional time do you usually add to training them and doing that?
So for me, when I know, like, when I'm expecting to train a person on something, I usually plan those out in the evenings. And then when it comes time for me to actually show them, however much time it takes for me to do something, I usually add on, I either double or triple the time. So if I'm analyzing behavioral data and it takes me like 8 hours to do like 20 animals, if I gave that to a student and showed them how to do that, I would expect that student to take at least 16 to 24 hours. So then that 16 to 24 hours equates to about, you can probably just say they could spend like 2 or 3 hours a day. I would expect them to take a few weeks to accomplish what I would do in an 8-hour period. So when it comes to planning, I do that in the evenings. When it comes to working with them and giving them tasks, however long it takes me to do it, I double or triple the time and tell them, here's how much time I'd expect you to spend on it. Please integrate this with whatever other time commitments you have. That way they can meet certain deadlines. So does that sort of answer your question?
Yes, yes, thank you.
And let's see. So any other questions? Okay, so quickly, because I think we're running low on time. So these are just 3 more sections that I'll cover really quickly because we're running low on time. So the first is going to be ways to improve communication, providing feedback, and also monitoring your mentor-mentee progress. So for communication, one thing I learned working with mentees over the years is that what is said is not always what is understood and comprehended. So just because you give instructions doesn't mean they comprehend it. So some ways that I'm checking is that my mentee understands what's going on is I have them summarize or repeat back instructions. So that way it shows me that they are thinking about what they're doing in lab. Or I'd have my mentee submit sort of experimental outline of what they're doing. So if I want them to split cells, do cell culture and split cells for me, they would write back what types of volumes they're using for each reagent, how long they're going to be incubating, and like things like trypsin, what sort of flask they're going to be putting these cells into. So I have them write out a plan for what they're doing after I give them those instructions. So that's just a way for me to know that they understand what I am asking them to do. And also just tell my mentee if there's ever any questions, just reach out to me for clarification as needed. So like, this is an example of what I ran into when I was at Virginia Tech, where I had a student, I had tubes 11 through 20 of brain samples. I need to incubate those brain samples in a reagent for a few hours. So I told the student, here are the old tubes, label these new tubes 11 through 20, one for each tube. What I was expecting is that they would just copy these numbers onto new tubes, 11, 12, 13, 14. What the student heard and what they did was they asked me, do you mean to label all these new tubes 11-20? And I was like, label them 11 through 20. So then what she ended up doing was labeling all these new tubes 11-20 for each one of my brain samples. So then I couldn't use any of those because we couldn't figure out which ones came from which original tubes. So even though in my head, when I asked her to label the tubes 11 through 20 for each tube, I wanted to see 11 through 20 copied over. What she heard was every tube should say 11-20 on it. And that's what she put, and that's how all the brains got mixed up. So just because we said it doesn't mean that it was understood. So when working with your mentee, try and find ways of checking for understanding as you go along so that your samples don't get ruined. If things pop up in lab, you should be providing feedback to your mentee as they complete your different protocols, as well as periodically throughout the semester or semesters. Feedback can be positive, where you just do this naturally at the end of the semester, or you can give feedback when things pop up. So if something does pop up and like say a student just ruins all the samples, that could be an opportunity where you provide feedback on what happened. So this should usually be done in private. You don't want to do this in front of everyone in the lab. So you don't want to be a spectator sport. So when I'm approaching the student, try and be positive in your approach. You don't want to be angry at the student. Mistakes happen. Focus on the issue and not the student as a person, allow response from that student of what happened, so it's not just a one-sided conversation. Work on solutions to how this sort of thing can't happen again, or reduce the chances of it happening again. And at the end, just provide a summary of all that you discussed at the end of your meeting. So you can provide feedback in a positive light of you're doing great, or you can provide feedback of things went wrong. Let's figure out what happened. Let's try and find ways for it to not happen again. And every semester that you're working with your mentee, try and find a way to sort of have regular check-ins to see how your mentor-mentee pairing is going along. So this could be through end of semester evaluations. It could be annual evaluations, or where you just have one-on-one meetings. And that's a chance for the mentee for you to discuss with your mentee how the student has grown since the last time you've had an evaluation. What sort of goals did you have and what sort of goals were met? And if you didn't reach the goals, like what can you do to sort of get back on track? And that's also a chance for you to provide feedback on areas of improvement for your mentee moving forward. And that's also a time for your mentee to give you feedback as a mentor of how the mentoring pairing is going, how that your training style is working for them, things that do work and things that don't work. So that's the end of my presentation. Do y'all have any questions about improvements for communication, providing feedback, or monitoring your mentor-mentee pairings? Okay. So if there's no questions, thank you for your time.